Hello everybody. So in this session we are going to reassemble a rear shock absorber for a Phantom 3. Now this shock is very similar to some of the later pre-war cars that also have ride control. So it's very similar to Derby Bentley, Wraith, 2530, and maybe very late 2025, maybe also very late Phantom 2. So it has a lot of the same similar features and design. They don't completely interchange. There may be different mountings. The arm may be different to where the connect to the link for the rear axle, and there's some other things. But overall, there's probably a lot of internal parts that interchange. But in typical Rolls-Royce fashion, things didn't always interchange. They like to have things very specialized for each model. So I'll just give a little rundown on the major componentry. So first we have the main body, which is really quite a nice casting. It has bronze bushings, and in the bronze bushings rides the arm that connects it to the link for the rear axle. And these are a really nice fit. And also inside the main casting is the cylinder for where the piston goes back and forth. This is the piston. The unique thing about it is that it's actually two halves. You see the split there, and then it's held together by springs. There's some really super strong springs inside of here, and they're really hard to pull apart. And then to connect the piston to the pivot arm is this little connecting rod. So that's all pretty self-explanatory. With the arm, you have to have this piece here, and inside this piece are the seals. Now I bored out this housing and then insert modern oil seals. Originally it would have been this arrangement. You would have had tallow string like this, and then you would have had a bronze piece that compressed it, and a spring that held against the bronze piece. And this was a very effective seal. But going to the more modern oil lip seal is usually a better choice. You'll notice that there's a little bit of wear on the shaft there from the tallow seal. And the nice thing about putting in 3 modern oil seals is that it won't be in the same wear rut as it was with the tallow. So it'll be a very effective seal. That's just a small amount of wear and nothing really to worry about. A unique feature of these is that it has ride control. So in the end, we have this little aluminum housing, and inside it is a bellows. And so what happens is, when oil comes in here from the ride control pump, it puts pressure on the bellows, and the bellows moves a little bit, and that little bit of movement presses against the spring, which presses against this diaphragm, and that diaphragm goes into the seal housing at the back like that. And on the other side of this hole, get this paper gasket chunk out of there. The other side of this hole, you might even be able to see it in there, is the other part of that diaphragm. So that distance, that opening there, is what controls the reaction of the shock absorber. And just to explain what a shock absorber does is it controls the amount of bounce that your springs have. So if you're riding along in your car and you had no shock absorbers and you hit a bump, your car would bounce and keep bouncing and keep bouncing. You hit another bump, it'll bounce even more. So the shock absorber stabilizes that amount of bounce. So right when the bounce happens, it controls it, stops it. Instead of bouncing continuously, it just brings it to not an abrupt end, but enough of an end so that you don't continue along down the road with that bouncing, because that can be very dangerous and you can ultimately get into an accident because you can lose control of your car. So in a course, we had to make a bunch of paper gaskets. This one isn't completely finished yet. And this is what the old paper gaskets look like. I was able to salvage some of them. And then these are the new paper gaskets I just made. And I have done a little video on making paper gaskets. And I recommend you watch that in order to know how to make these quickly and painlessly. So the place to start at this point is to get the piston inside of the bore of the housing. But I did want to show you one thing first, and that's how this connecting rod fits in. Now it has to be done with the piston in place, but I just wanted to show you how that spring action works. I don't know if I can do this here by hand, or now I'm going to take it over to the vise real quick. I squeezed it in there using the vise, and now you can see how it fits, and that's the gap there from the springs I mentioned, and then you have that pivoting action. And look how beautifully constructed these pistons and connecting rod is. These are all really super good forgings. I gave this piston a polish in the lathe with some worn emery paper, and so now it usually comes out a little easier, but you don't want to pinch your fingers in there. So now we'll proceed to put the piston inside the bore of the housing there. We want to put a fair amount of oil on it. The oil here I'm using is not going to be the oil I'm actually going to run it in. This is just oil I'm using for assembly. When it comes time for testing and all, then I'll discuss a little bit more about the oil. So we want to make sure we got enough in there. Get our piston in. This is a super close clearance. Oops. Feel something come up solid like that, then flip it around. Sort of work it back in and get the lubrication worked in there. Something in there I gotta investigate. This is not something you want to force in or hammer into place. Okay, let's see what that does. There it goes, very nicely. So that just shows that it's a really super good fit still. So then we get our opening in position there. And then we put in our connecting rod. Now there's, on this one, there's more room on the oil fill side here. So that's the side you want to have the nut on for the bolt that goes through here. So just keep that in mind. So then we get this all lined up. We can snap it in. So now we have the connecting rod in. Just double check that things feel free and all. The arm in place. Get some oil on this shaft. We take our seal housing. Work that on like this. Feels very nice. And then we need to put our gasket in position. I'm actually going to put the gasket on this portion. I'm going to give it a little spray of Hylamar. Hylamar is a Rolls-Royce approved product. Not that it really matters a whole lot. So we have that in. Then we have to make sure that we have the cutout for the bolt facing the right way. So that means it can only go in one way. You can't put it in that way, you can't put it in this way. You can only go in this one way. Take a little bit of wiggling, persuading. If everything's in good shape, you should be able to put it in without being too forceful. And you want to also make sure things are working nicely as you're going in. Get the bolt in. And that's where the bolt goes. Here's a bolt, and of course it has pinholes, and you want to make sure. Now this one has 2 pinholes, so I guess they were being generous. So we get that installed. Nut on. You want that nut good and tight. I'm just going to use this wrench for the time being to get it on a bit more. Okay. So everything feels really nice. And that's what you want. You can even hear it. You can see the piston sticking out a little bit. because a portion of it goes into the Alright, so next thing I like to do is get these nuts on. Of course, we always use new lock washers. The nuts I may need to take off again and clean them up. I like them good and clean. These are just quarter BSF. These two. I'll just get these tightened down a little bit to keep things in place. Still feels really, really nice. I'm happy. Very, very happy. So the next section to go on is this guy. This piece here. I need to finish this one hole. So yeah, so you have this sneaky little hole down here, and that's a very important hole. So I need to open that hole up. We now install the valve body. First the gasket. Keep in mind that the small hole of the valve body and the gasket goes to the top, large hole on the bottom. So again, large hole on the bottom, small hole on the top. Now we install the special long reach nuts and new 5/16 lock washers. Like typical Rolls-Royce fashion, they use specialized nuts. They have a 5/16 thread, 5/16 BSF, but a 1/4 inch hex. tight, of course. So we are now ready to install the ride control portion of the rear shock absorber. So, the first thing is this diaphragm piece, which goes into here. Now, for some reason, they have a spacer washer, I guess, to help to control the valving. So that goes on there. We're going to apply a little bit of oil to this. And insert that there. Make sure everything's good and free. Put a little bit more oil on just to keep things good and lubricated. Now we're ready for a gasket. So I just want to verify that I mean the gasket with the large hole. Okay. So now the blue stuff on these is Hylamar, not to be confused with the blue oil that I'm using for the lubricant assembling. So we get our gasket in place. We put our aluminum spacer in, flange down. Now we need another gasket. I believe these two are identical. And then in this case, we have these two washers, which also control the load of the valving. These go in like such. We put a little oil on this and that'll keep these from slipping off, sort of hold them in place. So then our spring goes on like that, and then our bellows, just checking that they don't want to fall out there. Okay. And now we have the housing that goes over the bellows. Another washer, of course, or gasket. Oops. Might have picked up the wrong gasket. So you just got to work it over the bellows. When I do the other side, I may opt to make this center hole a little larger. Once you get it over to bellows, there's a recess there that it'll go into. Okay. So now again we add a little bit of lubricant on there. Then we can install the rear cover. Okay, very good, very good. Then the 2BA nuts and lock washers. I wanted to point out we have this little screw here, a little hex head bolt, and that's for bleeding out air in the ride control system. Tighten these down. And they feel good. So, while we have that all together, I like to go back and give it a little more exercise, making sure things are feeling good. You can hear the air pumping in it. So now what I need to do is tighten down this nut and get a pin in it, and then I also need to install the cap that goes here, and then I'll be at a point where I can fill it up with oil and test to see how it feels before I put the cap on and the plug in. So in order for me to get this good and tight, I'm going to hold it in my vise with a set of soft jaws, and that way I can really get it good and tight, because even though it's pinned and it's on a square spline, you still want this good and tight. You don't want any looseness there, because this is going to be constantly moving up and down as you're going down a bumpy road or something, and you don't want anything jiggling loose. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten these up and put the pin in. So we have our split pin in place, castellated nut good and tight, split pin in. And you have to make sure you get the pin in as nice and neat as possible, because you really have very, very small amount of clearance to work with there. You can just see how close that comes to the housing. And everything feels nice and smooth, no stickiness, or slack or anything like that. And the oil that I like to put in these is the Valvoline VR1, and I do a 30 weight. So I think that the VR1 has a nice protection with the zinc and phosphorus. There's plenty of that in there, which I think the shock absorbers will benefit from that because you have a lot of rubbing surfaces. So we'll put the arm down just to give us, or up maybe. Yeah, okay, we'll put the arm up just to give us a little room. I normally don't put the cap on, the top on, I should say, until after I have it filled up and I exercised it and worked all the air out of its system. So now, originally, the chart called for a 20 weight oil, but I like to go a little thicker since modern driving involves more higher speed on smoother roads. Then I think the thicker oil is a benefit. You may even go up to a 40 weight, perhaps. But I'm sure 30 will be safe and will allow for an improvement for the higher speed driving. As we work it, the oil starts to flow into all the channels and into the valve area. Whoops. And as that happens, you'll feel resistance, stiffness developing, because you're basically pumping the oil from one side to the other. So even though I'm filling from one side to another, the chamber is completely open and oil does flow to both sides. I'm just doing it that way because I can see the oil pulling up on one side and the other. And I think it said on the drawing that these hold, was it I think an imperial pint. At least I'm assuming it's an imperial pint and not a U.S. pint, because that's what they would have been using in Great Britain at that time. And an imperial pint is, I believe, larger, slightly larger than a U.S. pint. And as I say, as the oil gets into the passageways and all, you'll feel the resistance on as you're pushing your arm up and down. I'm just gonna lightly put it top in there. So we'll put this in lightly to keep it from splashing out there. You can still hear the air purging out of it. And they'll become quite stiff. You'll be surprised at how much resistance these have. And so there's still air coming out. A lot of times people ask me about the paint finish that I use. And this is a urethane single stage paint, and it's Glazerite 22 line, which I think is a phenomenal product. Has a lot of nice gloss to it. It's nice to spray. And it's an automotive paint. It's really intended for body panels. So now another thing I'll demonstrate here is inside the cap I just put on. So I'm bringing the camera up to it. Right in here, you had the stem of the bellows sticking out here. So inside this cap, I experimented by putting a small nut inside here to press against the bellows. So as I tighten this nut up, that'll push the bellows, which will push that spring and then close that valving sump. And in doing that, that has significantly made this harder to press down and pull up. Of course, it's made it even stiffer for pulling up. And then if I loosen this, see, I loosened it up quite a bit there. Then that makes it easier again. So that just demonstrates how that ride control functions, because when you have oil pressure going in there, it's going to push against those bellows and do the same sort of thing. So now you can see how I can easily push that down, and then on its way down, as I tighten this up, it gets stiffer, and it'll almost, I could probably stiffen it up to the point where I couldn't move it. So so then that just demonstrates how that works. And this was the little nut that I put in there to take that space up. So again, it's not something you want to do when the shock absorber is in use. It's just something to demonstrate to you what it's like. So you can see just how easily I can move it now. So now these caps have an aluminum spacer washer, and this thickness is probably very important for the setting of the reaction of the shock absorber. So you want to make sure you keep these to their respective shock absorber when you have two of them apart. So what I like to do when I finally get to this point, we're not going to put the lid on yet. Make sure you note that there's this little hole here, and that's an oil hole, and that's so that oil can get into that hole to lubricate the bronze bushing that's here on this side. So what I like to do is I'll put it on a nice, clean, dry surface, just like this, and I'll let it sit there, and maybe for a few days, and just periodically check to make sure that there's no leaks developing anywhere. The last thing you want after all this work is to have a gasket that leaks or some other thing like that that you really don't want to have to deal with again. Okay, so this is what I mean about having it on a clean surface. So I'll let it sit here for maybe a couple days because I have work to do with the other shock absorber and the bracketry and all. And I just periodically check and make sure that there are no leaks from any of the gaskets or the joints or anywhere. And then when I pick it up, I'll look underneath there and see if I notice any drips on the paper towels. And again, I think that's important because you don't want to get this far into it and have a leak, and if it's something at this stage, you can easily fix it. And I also leave the cap off of the back just in case some oil tries to migrate out of there, like through a bellows, a crack in the bellows or something like that. And just keep an eye on things. And then I still have to clean up some of the hardware and make gaskets for the tops, and so I'll do that while this sits here and waits for my next attention.